The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight, John Michael McGrath and yours truly put Donald Trump's 25% tariff threats under the microscope, along with Premier Doug Ford's very disappointed response. Then, the Agenda's Week in Review looks at the latest spat between Ontario and Toronto, where some people think the Premier would rather be the mayor of the capital city. OnPoli is next. Hey, partner.
Hello, sir.
Little sugar to start with, as always. I'm feeling very nostalgic today, which is why I'm wearing this T-shirt.
Okay, you're going to have to explain the T-shirt.
I will, because I figure you don't follow junior hockey all that carefully, do you?
Not super closely, no.
Okay, this team, the Hamilton Bulldogs, no longer exist.
Okay.
They actually moved to Brantford. They're now the Brantford Bulldogs.
Okay.
And the Hamilton Bulldogs are no more. So I wear this shirt out of respect for my hometown, out of respect for the former team, and out of the hope that someday some kind of hockey will return to the ambitious city.
So there's currently no...
There is no tenant in what they used to call Cops Coliseum, and which I forget what the arena is now called. First Ontario Place Centre, I forget. Anyway, no, we need hockey in Hamilton, and I don't know what it's going to be, but hopefully it'll be something soon.
Maybe next year.
And you won't be going to the games anyway, so it doesn't matter.
I mean, I don't go to Toronto hockey games. I'm not sure I'm going to go to Hamilton once.
Why am I co-hosting a podcast with you? I cannot figure that out. Anyways, let's start with a little bit of an update here on who's going where, starting at Ottawa Centre, where the current MPP Joel Harden has already announced he is not seeking re-election provincially because he wants to be the federal candidate for the NDP in the next federal election, whenever that is. He doesn't yet have the nomination secured to run for the NDP, and the party, provincially, has already announced his replacement. That'd be Catherine McKenney, who ran for mayor of Ottawa in the last municipal election, lost to Mark Sutcliffe. Catherine McKenney will be the NDP candidate in Ottawa Centre whenever that election takes place, as we know, scheduled for 2026, but who knows?
We are suspecting that it might not adhere to the schedule.
We are suspecting, yes indeed. What else?
Then on the government benches, we have an announced, not exactly a departure, but John Yakubuski, who has been the MPP for Renfrew, Nipissing, Pembroke since 2003. He has announced he will not seek re-election. Mildly miffed about this because I asked him a few days before he made the announcement official if he was going to be running for re-election, and he very politely declined to answer the question. I think he said that will be answered in the fullness of time.
Well, that's usually a hint that the answer is no.
Yeah, but it's not an on-the-record answer.
Right.
So a historical note for our regular listeners, only one other MPP has ever represented the riding of Renfrew, Nipissing, Pembroke since the riding was created. That was Sean Conway, the Liberal MP who you spoke about, MPP, who you spoke about a few weeks ago, Steve. After a bit of a squeaker in the 2003 election, which was a very good year for Liberals, Dalton McGuinty led that party to a big majority in the legislature. Yakubuski routinely won his seat by huge margins, ridiculous margins, like
biggest in the province most of the time, I think.
I'm certain in most cases. I mean, I think in the last election it was like 67% or 68%.
Yeah.
It was just, it's a rural riding. Rural ridings tend to be good for the PCs these days, but I think we can fairly say it also helps that John Yakubuski's father was Paul Yakubuski, a former MPP for the area as well, going back to the Bill Davis days.
Two follow-ups there. Paul Yakubuski had 17 children.
Yes.
John was one of them. John ran for office and obviously kept the seat in the family. But you know what? The seat was never out of the family. Do you know who the Yakubuski's cousin is who also held that seat? Sean Conway.
Yes.
They are all related. It's all in the family, as Carol O'Connor would have said.
We've talked a few times on this podcast about some of the cousin connections that cross not just, family lines, but party lines
Partisan
as well.
lines as well,
Yes.
yeah. Now, there are a shrinking number of PCs who predate the election win of Doug Ford in 2018. There's still a handful left. You got a bit of a list there for us?
Yeah, so there were a bunch of announcements at the end of the last legislature back in 2022 of Tories who would not run again, and we saw a lot of the old hands in the party decide that they would not run again. By my count, and it's possible I will be corrected on this, but by my count, there are 9 progressive conservative MPPs left who predate the 2018 election win. I'm going to try and do this quickly. We have Ernie Hardeman, elected in 95, Laurie Scott, 2003, Bob Bailey, 2007, Steve Clark, elected 2010, Vic Fideli, elected 2011, Raymond Cho, Lauren Coe, and Sam Oosterhoff, all elected in 2016, and then Ross Romano of Sault Ste. Marie, who was elected in 2017 in what I believe was the final by-election of the 41st Parliament. So that is 9 out of a current caucus of 79 progressive conservatives, and 3 others, of course, who were elected as PCs but currently sit as independents. In one sense, this is not an unusual story, right? Turnover happens in the legislature, particularly when you lead a party from the opposition benches to the government, right? The caucus just gets much larger, and so it's not like a mystery that this kind of thing happens. But I do think it's notable how thorough the turnover really has been. I started covering Queen's Park in 2013, and the fact that I am now senior to much of the legislature is kind of a weird headspace to be in. I do also have to note, and I think it's funny in this context, that Sam Oosterhoff, the youngest MPP in the legislature, I think, or certainly the youngest elected ever, is in this sense an elder statesman in his caucus.
That's true. I'm trying to remember now. Was he 19 when he first won election?
It was like 18 or 19.
Yeah.
It was like he was just a few months after his birthday and was able to run.
And now an elder statesman.
Yes.
Life is funny. All right, let's get on to issue 1. President-elect Donald Trump has said he will impose a 25% tariff on Canada's and Mexico's imports into the United States unless, he says, we figure out the situation with the border. He says drugs and migrants are coming across into the United States. Response to these punishing tariff threats has been swift. Here is Premier Ford.
I found his comments unfair. I found them insulting. It's like a family member stabbing you right in the heart.
Stabbing you right in the heart. That is from this Premier, that is a very impassioned response. What now?
Well, in one sense, of course, we've been here before. This will be the second Trump administration. So at the moment, we see the federal and provincial governments kind of returning back to a prior playbook that they used in the first Trump term. They've already held meetings with the prime minister and the premiers to discuss strategy. In the first Trump administration, it was very common for the premiers to work the phones with like governors of states on the border and to emphasize how much trade crosses the U.S.-Canadian border, how many jobs in their states rely on exports from our provinces, that kind of thing. The Premier has said that if the Americans do go forward with tariffs on Canadian goods, then of course Canada would retaliate with its own tariffs. It is worth clarifying here that tariffs would be a federal decision and not something that the Ontario legislature could impose. But there's a category of things called non-tariff trade barriers,
yes.
And that's like what we do, frankly, with like a lot of interprovincial trade in Canada, where we make it difficult to move things from like Ontario to Quebec, for example. I imagine if the legislature got creative, you could figure out similar things to do with American-made goods. But at the moment, I'm not sure anybody has a ton of confidence about even how serious this threat will be. Like, will it actually materialize in January when the president is inaugurated? We're going to have to wait and see.
Well, I'll tell you one thing I'm hearing, and that is I have heard from numerous people already, and I suspect that there are many, many more in Canada right now, who say if Donald Trump persists in punishing us with tariffs, we're not going to go to the States. There are a lot of people in Canada, obviously, who like to get to someplace warmer during the winter months. And if a lot of Canadians decided we are going to take our tourism dollars and we're going to spend them elsewhere, we're going to we'll maybe go to Europe, maybe we'll stay in Canada, who knows? That could have an impact on America's bottom line. Of course, the better thing would be for neither side to tariff the other and sanity to prevail, but we shall see.
Yes. So, a trade war is never going to be good. I think it would be fair to say just commonsensically that Canada has more to lose than the U.S. does. We are far more dependent on exports to the U.S. than the U.S. is of exports to us. But there are some industries where that distinction kind of doesn't make any sense, right? Like the auto industry being one where the whole structure of the auto industry, particularly in the Midwest, really depends on seamless trade across the border.
And the parts are from everywhere.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Something like $500 billion in goods move across the border each year. A lot of that, of course, happens in Ontario particularly. I mean, a story I may have told before, but, if you've never done it sometime, people should drive down to Windsor and then turn around and come right back up. But the drive on the 401 from Windsor to Toronto, you instinctively understand how much trade is coming across that bridge at the bottom of the 401 because you are just in that traffic, that truck traffic, the entire way. And when I made that drive for the first time, it's suddenly like you can know all the trade statistics, but then you're on the highway with all those trucks and you feel the commerce around you. So yeah, a trade war would be absolutely devastating to both to Canada and Ontario.
Having said all of that, we do have to remember that in Trump 1.0,
Yes.
he did do, he said a lot of things. He said he would do a lot of things. And he announced that he was going to do a lot of things. We thought they would be catastrophic and then not particularly well thought through. He'd blast something out on social media, and then in the fullness of time, some of his advisors would talk him down off the ledge, and these things would not happen. That could happen this time too, presumably.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, past performance is not a guarantee, but it's frankly all we've got to go on right now. I do think that there was a hope among a lot of Canadian leaders, policymakers, that somehow all the things that Trump had been saying for the last year wouldn't really apply to us. That, oh, well, sure, he'll talk about tariffs against China, but he doesn't really mean that he's going to put tariffs on Canadian goods. Like, why would he do that? We're so nice. We're so kind. And I think this week has been a bit of a wake-up call. I think we should understand that the president-elect means what he says, and that the next 4 years are probably looking a bit more fraught than they were.
He does know that 210 years ago, we did cross the border, went down there and burned down the White House. He does remember that, doesn't he?
I mean, I wouldn't swear to what he learned in high school history.
And with that, we're off to issue 2. Sheridan College, one of Canada's largest post-secondary institutions, will see major cuts to programming and will lay off staff as they expect to lose $112 million next year. The cap on international students and chronic underfunding are the major sources of these varsity blues, if we can call them that. What else, JMM? This is tough news for Sheridan.
No, absolutely. We suspect that this is just, one of several post-secondary institutions that have talked about the financial distress they're in. There's been some sort of alarming reports out of Queens in Kingston earlier this year. But, broadly speaking, we have discussed before on this podcast the Blue Ribbon Panel that was created to look at the post-secondary funding crisis. The then Minister of Colleges and Universities, Jill Dunlop, who is, of course, now the Education Minister, she announced a $1.3 billion funding package for colleges and universities that amounted to about half or less than half of the funding that the panel had actually recommended. So I suspect, are going to see more stories like this, that, a financial shortfalls, combination of declining enrollment and underfunding from the provincial government will be leading to program cuts. In the case of Sheridan, we are already seeing that. I believe that their really world-renowned animation program is likely to be canceled, and one is a bit maybe personal for both of us. I believe they're also canceling or shrinking their journalism program.
Well, jobs for journalists today?
Yeah, I mean, I was joking off camera that might be humanitarian.
Right. Now, this, of course, is coming to a head because the federal government decided, in its wisdom, to reduce significantly the number of international students it's going to allow coming into Canada. Obviously, the post-secondary sector has been relying mightily on those international students who pay 3, 4, 5, 6 times as much tuition as domestic students. They've been relying on that infusion of money to keep their institutions alive. You've got to know, and you hinted at this a second ago, but you've got to know that if a big place like Sheridan is feeling the financial bite, then everybody is. I mean, there might be 2 or 3 post-secondary institutions in the whole province who may be, I don't want to say immune, but let's say less adversely affected by this, University of Toronto obviously being one of them. If this is the situation at Sheridan, I forget what we've got here, something like 21 universities, 24 colleges, then they're all feeling this big time. I guess one of the questions I've got is, you mentioned about the Blue Ribbon panel that was supposed to, that recommended some big time increases in transfer payments to these institutions. Why has it not happened?
There's the old joke in politics, $1 billion here, $1 billion there. Pretty soon you're talking real money.
Yep.
The government has a bunch of demands on the public purse that it has to choose from. And if I can be blunt about it, I think the post-secondary sector is always going to struggle to get money from conservative governments in particular. I don't think anybody in the Premier's office is going to lose sleep about cuts to the animation program at Sheridan. Now, maybe they should, right? Film, TV, even video games, these are all major employers in the province of Ontario. But at least at the moment, it does not seem to have grabbed the government's attention.
And interestingly enough, this provincial government has, from what I hear, been good to the film and television, the content creation sector in this province. They're, all the tax cuts and tax breaks that were in place are still in place, have been enhanced on. We've got just a ton of production happening, particularly at the waterfront in Toronto. So, it's not like they don't understand how remunerative this is when it comes to that kind of thing. But here we are. Anyway, with that, we're off to issue 3. We do talk a lot on the onpoli podcast about what the government is up to, but the opposition parties would like a piece of your attention too, so let's do that now. A couple of things from the official and unofficial opposition MPPs. Official opposition and NDP leader Marit Stiles introduced a plan to close fundraising loopholes that have created, as she calls it, a cash for access culture in Ontario politics. Okay, what's this all about?
So the NDP has filed a complaint with the Integrity Commissioner over ministerial fundraising targets and whether they violate the ethics rules. There have been complaints about the role of fundraising and particularly the role that parties ask MPPs and ministers to engage in when they do partisan fundraising. This goes back to at least Kathleen Wynne's time as Premier. There was a scandal, people may remember, that it turned out that Liberal cabinet ministers were being given some explicit numerical targets of the amount of money that they were expected to raise. This, I think, not wrongly, seemed unseemly to people. And it was in the context of some other controversies that were dogging the government of the day. Kathleen Wynne brought in rules that effectively forbade ministers from attending these kinds of fundraisers. The 2018 election happens. Doug Ford and the Tory government then repealed those rules, and cabinet ministers and MPPs could go back to attending these fundraisers. And so we had a moment where there was a hue and cry about this cash for access culture. The rules were changed. An election happened, the rules were changed back, and now, 6 years later, we have yet again this question of a cash for access culture.
Everything old is new again.
Yes.
The NDP makes the point that they believe it is unseemly for example, the Minister of Energy to send out a fundraising request and to all the energy generation companies in the province of Ontario, anybody who does business with the Ministry of Energy, saying, I'm holding a fundraiser, please give me $1,500 and come to this, and then I will make decisions on your sector on who's going to, potentially who's going to prosper and who's not.
Yeah.
The NDP says that is rife with conflict of interest, not just appearance, but actual, and they would like to do something about it.
No, and it's easy to forget just how pervasive the provincial interest is in the economy broadly. I mean, obviously, the provincial government would like a growing economy, a rapidly growing economy, but like the detailed regulation of all sorts of business sectors goes through ministers' offices. And, you want to be careful. I don't want to defame anybody. But there's a reason why this stuff looks bad. There's a reason, like historically, there were actual controversies about decisions that were made by previous governments. This government is, I will remind our viewers, this government is currently being investigated about questions about what they knew about the Greenbelt Plan and whether those people were campaign donors, that kind of thing. So yes, this is an issue that the NDP are raising. We will see what, if anything, the Integrity Commissioner says in response.
Meantime, let's take a look at what the other, I guess, significant opposition party, although they haven't got very many seats down there, but the Liberals under Bonnie Crombie have had some Ministry of Health documents leaked to them showing some very concerning projections. And I'll just go through some of the numbers here. More than 2,000 doctors serving 3 million people in Ontario are on the verge of retirement. That's not good. Well, it might be good for the doctors, but it's certainly not good for the patients. More than 200 Ontario communities, think of this, more than 200 Ontario communities don't have a single family doctor living in them. More than 4 million people in the province are not rostered to their own family doctor. This is concerning.
Right. I mean, that 200 Ontario communities number, I mean, there are only 444 municipalities in the entire province. So I don't know exactly whether communities is a perfect synonym for municipalities in this context, but
it's a lot.
It's a lot. There are huge parts of this province where it's very difficult to get a doctor right now. And this, of course, the Liberals are raising this. This is part and parcel of their attacks in recent weeks on the government's healthcare policies. We talked a few episodes ago about the Liberals raising how many people in a riding by riding level they were able to break down that data and show how many people don't have primary healthcare providers. Of course, the Liberals were good to emphasize how many conservative ridings or how many people living in conservative ridings, rather, are going without a family doctor. Fair time for the government here. It is not like they are doing nothing. They are building new medical schools, funding new nursing programs. Those take time to actually graduate new practitioners. They did also announce this week that they are expanding the medical services that nurse practitioners can provide. Nurse practitioners are a class of nurse that generally have, they are able to do more medically than a registered nurse would be able to. They don't necessarily need to be supervised by a doctor to provide certain services. That is another way of making medical care easier to access, at least for some people. But this stuff all takes time.
And this just highlights how important the work is that Dr. Jane Philpott will be doing for this government. She, the former federal health minister, former Liberal health minister, tasked by this progressive Conservative government to come in, take 5 years, figure out a plan to make sure that every Ontarian has access to a family doctor. Let's go, right? Okay, and with that, time for your column, my column. And it's time now for our regular feature, Your Column, My Column, in which JMM and I reminisce about the columns we wrote for the TVO website this past week. What's on your agenda, sir?
Well, we've got a bit of a daily double, I think, between the two of us, because we're both talking about Trump and tariffs and what it all means. And, one of the points that I wanted to make in my column is just that you could see that Doug Ford had what I'm going to call like the plan A after Trump was reelected. Or do we say elected for a second time or reelected? It's complicated. The premier made a lot of noises about, what I'm going to say, making a separate peace with the incoming administration and, frankly, being willing to cut Mexico loose out of the continental trading bloc if that would preserve Canadian jobs. And you know what? For the job that Doug Ford has, which is protecting Ontario jobs, like whatever else you might think about it, I can see why he thought that was the right calculation. But I think the events of this week show that it didn't work. And that, and Doug Ford is certainly not alone in this problem. We were just talking about how I think a lot of Canadian policymakers are in the same boat. But I think the events of this week have shown that it was wishful thinking, and both Ontario and Canada need a plan B, and probably soon.
And I look forward to reading your column on Plan B whenever it comes forward, because I bet you're going to want to write about that if I know you.
I suspect I will, yes.
Why not?
How about you?
Yeah, you're quite right. We both went for the Daily Double this week. I also wanted to circle back to the Trump-Ford relationship. We heard the clip earlier of how heartbroken this Premier of Ontario is because he thought he had a special relationship with the incoming president of the United States, and clearly he does not. I think it's also fair to say that in Doug Ford's first term, we're going back to 2018 now, he very much modeled his premiership on the style of leadership that Donald Trump was presenting Americans with at the same time. Trump, of course, was the president at the time. The joke about Doug Ford was that he was a bull who brought his own china shop with him wherever he went. The premier quickly learned, to his credit, I would say, that the vast majority of Ontarians don't like Donald Trump, don't think he governs well, don't like his style of governing. And as a result, Doug Ford, over the course of time, 6.5 years now as premier, has become much less bombastic in his populist rhetoric. He's really toned that down. And as we have seen this past week in particular, his fawning over Donald Trump has become a lot less as well. I have no doubt that if he had a vote in the last American election, Doug Ford would have checked the box beside Donald Trump's name and not Kamala Harris's name. I think the premier is probably also wondering these days whether, despite his admiration for Trump, we might not actually have been better off under a President Harris, given that, and I think I'm on solid ground saying this, I doubt President Harris would be threatening Ontario and Canada and the rest of the world with 25% tariffs right now, threatening to bring our dollar down to 50 cents US, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So a tough time for Doug Ford right now in these regards.
Yes, just on your point, this is another case where I would say, you needn't have been terribly surprised by Trump's actions this week. And also, I think you would be on solid ground predicting that Kamala Harris would not have imposed these tariffs. And in both cases, you can just look at what they've been saying.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Harris ran against Trump's tariffs and, calling them she called them a massive working class tax increase, that kind of thing. So,
which is what tariffs are at the end of the day.
They are taxes.
They are taxes. At the end of the day, eventually someone's got to pay for them. That's right. Now, we are chock-a-block full of content this week, so no letters to the editor this week. We're going to save those for next week, and we'll just sign it off right now. That is the onpoli podcast for this Friday, November 29th, 2024.
You can follow our show on Apple Podcasts so that you get notified each time a new episode is available, and you can see the video version of the podcast on the TVO Today YouTube channel.
And until next Friday, everybody, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Let's go back to July 2023, when Doug Ford said that if Olivia Chow became the mayor of Toronto, it would be an unmitigated disaster. And then a few days later, after she won, he said, she's actually a very nice person. And then in November 2023, Ontario uploaded responsibility for the Gardiner Expressway and the Don Valley Parkway to the province, saving the capital city $1.9 billion over 10 years. So the relationship is looking pretty good. Then in October of 2024, Bill 212 prohibits bike lanes from being built if a lane of traffic is removed as a result. It would also allow the province to remove existing bike lanes, and this has begat a whole firestorm of controversy. John Sewell, the relationship between the city and the province has clearly become more problematic. What's going on?
Well, I mean, we've had this problem for a long, long time. I just think Mike Harris, he did a whole bunch of things to the city that never should have happened. He amalgamated the city against the wishes of 76% of the people who voted in the referendum. He downloaded a whole bunch of stuff. So it's the same stuff. And I mean, that's not all. Bill Davis even, and we all honor Bill Davis, but Bill Davis signed a thing called the Edmonton Agreement, I think in 1975, which said that the province would never reduce funds to to cities unless the cities agreed to it. And then, sure enough, later, a year or two later, he reduced those funds. So we're constantly in a fight. And the reason is that under the Constitution, Canada is a creature of Toronto is a creature of the provincial government. And so they can do what they want, and they do. And the city for a long time has been saying, we need powers that can't be interfered with by the provincial government.
More on that to come. All right, Amanda, what do you see?
I see that it is politically advantageous, candidly, for the province and the city to be fighting at different times. When Mayor Chow was first elected, it was politically advantageous for the Premier and her to get along, right? She got, I think, a huge win out of the upload. And now
the two highways.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And now that Premier Ford is looking into a potential election, now the rumors are that may actually not happen. I think they've seen the polling numbers, and they see that it's politically beneficial to pick this fight. Now, why is it politically beneficial to pick this fight? Because the people of the city are frustrated by gridlock. Just yesterday, I believe, the team in town to play, the NHL hockey team in town to play the Leafs, had to get out of their bus and walk through downtown Toronto because it's insane in a major city that we cannot function properly.
This was the Utah hockey team, right?
Well, who I've never heard of, by the way. I don't follow hockey.
They're brand new. It's
there's
okay.
a Utah hockey team, but they documented it all. Like, that is, it's funny, but it's actually just, it's criminal that we can't actually move people enough around in this city. So I think they're tapping into a frustration. I think it is real. And I think the idea that currently the city's governed by sometimes people downtown who think everybody, I live in Etobicoke now, that everybody rides bikes and doesn't have to drive cars. Like, I used to ride my bike all the time. I have to drive a car now. And they see proliferation of bike lanes at the expense of their own ability to get around when we haven't kept up with building transit. So I think it's a fight that they want to have.
Laura, you've been following the relationship between City Hall and the provincial legislature for some time now. They were getting along so well, and now they're not. How come?
Look, I think it's surprising that they have been getting along so well. I think, as we led into the segment, Steve, you kind of replayed Doug Ford's words from the past saying how much of a disaster Olivia Chow would be. He said this during the campaign, and he backed one of her main rivals, the former Toronto police chief. So kind of heading into it, everyone thought, well, Doug Ford and Olivia Chow are going to hate each other. They're never going to work. And then they sort of teamed up on this New Deal for Toronto. They both criticized the federal government for shelter spaces for refugees, and they were getting along. Look, I don't really see this as a personal fight between Doug Ford and Olivia Chow. I see this as Doug Ford being very heavily invested in the city of Toronto, obviously, as we've seen from pretty much day one when he slashed Toronto City Council in half and various other moves that he's made. He really cares about the city of Toronto. And he drives to Queen's Park. He sees the bike lanes in his area on Bloor Street. I think he's got, quite frankly, a bee in his bonnet on this particular issue. And he also sees the polling on it. And according to the Progressive Conservative polling arm, he views this as a popular measure, even from within the city. So I think, Amanda's right in that this is a political moment for him. There could be an election. He wants to kind of take on the issues that he views as popular, and he is a populist politician. But I think it's also deeply personal for him as an issue that he sees with his own eyes every day.
Well, let me pick up on that with John Sewell. He represents a riding in the 416. We actually have had very few premiers in Ontario history who represent a riding in Toronto.
Right.
So is there anything wrong with him taking, as a Toronto MPP, a particular interest in Toronto issues?
He can take an interest in it, but for him to override City Council on something it has clear legitimacy to do seems to me to be wrong. We have legislation that sort of outlines what the city can do and what it can't do, and he's willing to override that all the time. I mean, he's doing it with the supervised consumption sites as well. He's overriding legislation that clearly allows the city to do that. And it seems to me that government should try and stick out of the other people's turf.
Now, you go back a little bit, so I'm going to ask you to sort of look in the recesses of your memory here. Bob Rae was a premier who represented a Toronto riding. So was Kathleen Wynne.
Yep.
Did they get involved in the granular aspects of everyday life in the way that Doug Ford is?
No.
You're sure about that?
I'm sure. I'm pretty sure about that. And the same is true of Bill Davis. I gave that example about the Edmonton commitment, but that was a province-wide thing. It wasn't just about the city of Toronto.
Amanda, what about this notion that he's the premier? He should be looking out for provincial issues that have relevance province-wide, and he shouldn't be sticking his nose in where bike lanes do or are not supposed to go.
I mean, I understand people making that argument, but to your point, he is a Toronto MPP. People forget, but the Conservatives have, like the provincial or Progressive Conservatives have a huge amount of seats they have Toronto seats, not an insubstantial amount. So
this is, we should say as well, for elections from I think 2003 until 2018, I don't think the Conservatives won a single seat in Toronto.
No, that's true.
No.
Except one by-election, but not a general election seat in the whole city.
Exactly. And
so the fact that he's got a lot here now says something.
And it says that people like his idea of how the city should be run.
Let's just show the folks what you already know. We've got some Statistics Canada numbers here to share. And Sheldon, I'll ask you to bring these up right now. They call this onward migration, which basically is a fancy way for saying that's people who are leaving Canada. And this is over the last 20 years. And for those listening on podcast, I'll just describe what we've got here, which is essentially a graph showing what percentage of people who come then leave. And it's a pretty flat line until about 2017 when there's a big spike, but then it comes down again. But now here we are after COVID in 2020, and the line is spiking up again. So what concerns you about that trend?
Well, what we see is this phenomenon of people who are coming to Canada from around the world. And by the way, I should clarify, all the people in this study are permanent residents. So they all have the ability to stay and have chosen not to. We're not talking about temporary workers or international students. And this is, I think, quite alarming. There are a number of different ways to slice it. The view that you just showed is the year of leaving. We can also look at how people are leaving based on the year that they've arrived. What we've seen in that graph is actually a 30-year upward trend. So whilst there are spikes in recent years, conservative governments, liberal governments, all different types of economies, this phenomenon has been silently on the rise. And what does it mean? It means that people who are hand-selected in many respects, economic immigrants are actually the most likely to leave according to our study. Maybe we'll get into that soon. These people who are hand-selected for their ability to address some of Canada's most pressing economic and social needs in areas like healthcare, early childhood education, et cetera, are increasingly saying thanks but no thanks. And this is troubling because when they leave, the needs that they are brought here to address do not. And so Canada, as a country that's been dependent on immigration, I think should be concerned about this growing trend, not yet at a catastrophe level, but definitely rising and trending in the wrong direction of immigrants who are coming to the country and saying thanks but no thanks.
Can you tell whether they leave after 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, what?
Yeah, so that's actually a very important finding in our report. The number of immigrants that are projected to leave the country is about 20% over the long term, 20 to 25 years. But what we find is that most of that leaving happens in the first 7 years. And so there is this real spike in the graph between years 3 and 7 where the risk of departure is highest. It's like danger zone territory. But it's also actually an opportunity for intervention. If Canada can make those early years winning years, amazing years, satisfying years, such that people with these great talents from around the world decide, my decision to come here, this was the right move. This is the place where I would like to devote my talents and my energies to the country's success. This is the place where I belong and where my family belongs. That is to the great benefit of all Canadians, not just the immigrants who are coming here. But if we can't get people past that year 7 hump, then we lose on everything that they have to contribute. So that's, I think, what's at stake here.
On the other hand, I'll play devil's advocate here. You can imagine people who have been here for a few generations saying to themselves, this is a pretty good place to live in this world for a lot of people. And if they don't want to stick around, well, good riddance. What's wrong with thinking that way? Well,
this is a very good place to live. I'm, really fortunate to live here, and I really enjoy living here, as do, I imagine, most of your viewers, even those who have other options to live elsewhere. I think what this reflects, though, is a really dramatic change in the nature of who's coming. So, my parents came to Canada from South America, and they were, 18 and 19. One had finished high school, one had to finish over here. They spoke relatively little English, the proverbial $5 in your pocket.
What was their first language?
Spanish. They came from Chile. And Chile was in the midst of a coup and a dictatorship and all that kind of stuff. So everything in Canada was upside. Well, people who are coming today are coming in dramatically different circumstances. If you are applying in the point system today in Canada, you need to be basically in the top 5 percentile to be admitted. So that means that we are rejecting 95 to 96% of people who are applying. That's a level of competitiveness on par with Harvard University. So who are we getting? We're getting people who speak English and French, often both, impeccably well. We're getting people with advanced education and master's degrees. We're getting people, therefore, who were homeowners, who had domestic help in their country of origin, who came from 2-car, 2-driver households. These are people from the top of very unequal societies. And so they have a lot of different things to contribute than my parents had at the time, for example, but they also have global options. And so instead of immigration being a manifestation of our generosity as a country, which I think our conversation, our public debate still reflects that frame. Immigration needs to shift as we need to talk about this as a reflection of our ambition and as an admission, quite frankly, that an aging and shrinking society is a poorer, weaker, and less fun place to live. We need immigrants in many cases much more than they need us. And so the profile of the contemporary immigrant has changed a lot. The discourse around immigration has changed hardly at all. And the services that are available to immigrants have also changed, in my opinion, far, far too slowly. So like language classes, for example, are the #1 government-funded settlement service. 60% of immigrants are economic immigrants who have to take a language test as a condition of entry. And so many of them don't use these services. They're just not appropriate. Instead of thinking about how we can fix immigrants to improve their language skills and give them CV training, et cetera, because they need help, we need to start thinking about how we can sell these very talented people with global options on Canada so that they decide, this is my place. These are my people. This is where I belong. And this is where I would like to devote my talents and energies in the long term. That's what's at stake for Canada. We need, I think, to work a little bit harder to win over the affections of these talented people. And I should just add one more thing. This is not an issue of like promiscuity or disloyalty. These are people who are doing what you or me or anyone else watching the show would do. Make a big decision to uproot your family and move to another country. Give it 4, 5, 6 years to see how it's going. And if you don't think it's working out, you'll pursue other options.
Do those other options include, maybe you could tell me which is more prevalent, going back to their country of origin, or are they picking yet another country to go to?
So we don't know that from this data. We suspect most of the returning is to the country of origin. I know there's a lot of interest, for example, in moving to the United States, but that's actually really hard to do.
Harder now, I would think.
Harder now, yeah, for sure. So we have more work to do there, but we do know that they're not staying in Canada, and that's the prime concern here.
Do we have any reason to believe that Donald Trump's approach to this region of the world in his next term will be any different than it was during his last term? Einat Wilf, why don't you start us out on that?
It's tough to know. We can gauge through the nominations and the declarations. Certainly the nominations on issues facing Israel, so the ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, the ambassador to the United Nations, which is obsessed with Israel, so Elise Stefanik, and the Secretary of Foreign Affairs, the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, are all strong pro-Israel supporters. So hopefully this sends a message that this is going to be the direction of his administration. He's also made it clear that he wants to pursue peace. He definitely feels that after ending his previous term with 4 peace and normalization agreements and momentum for more, he feels that the momentum was stopped by the policies of the Biden administration, and he's clearly eager to renew that momentum.
Khaled Al-Gindi, how do you see it?
Well, Donald Trump is notoriously unpredictable, but there's not a whole lot of mystery given that we have the record of the first administration and based on the appointments. I think we're not just talking about a pro-Israel orientation. We're talking about the most far-right extremist, even messianic ideological views coming into this administration. People who openly say that there is no such thing as a Palestinian people. There is no such thing as an occupation. You have noted well-known Islamophobes and other bigots entering this administration. So it is I think, an understatement to simply call it pro-Israel. It is aligned with the most extreme messianic elements of the Israeli government, which of course is also quite extreme. These are people who believe that God is in control of events, and there is no need for things like diplomacy or they're in a realm of the other world and not normal politics. So I think it's an extremely dangerous administration that is shaping up, particularly when you combine it with a far-right extremist Israeli government that believes, some of whom believe in expelling Palestinians and in annexing the West Bank it's a different ballgame, I think, Trump 2 than Trump 1.
John Allen, how do you see it?
Well, I think I agree with both in a way. I think what we have to see is whether or not the people that Trump has appointed have any real power, or what is really going to happen is that Donald Trump is going to decide what he wants to do. Clearly, if Mike Huckabee had his way, there would be no two-state solution, and the West Bank would be annexed tomorrow, and I don't think that's going to happen. I certainly hope it doesn't happen. And we do know that Donald Trump wants to make deals. He tried to make the deal of the century with respect to Israel-Palestine last time. It wasn't much of a deal for the Palestinians. And he may well try that again, putting pressure on Palestine to come to the table. We'll see. There's also the possibility of a Saudi-Israel-U.S. deal. That deal, the last time it was being negotiated pre-October 7, did not have much or anything for the Palestinians. But the Saudis have now changed the game, and they are demanding sometimes a path forward to the two-state solution, sometimes a Palestinian state, depending on when they've been speaking lately. So,
well, let me stop you there, because there's so many good points that everybody's made so far that I need to follow up on. Let me start with the ambassador to Israel that Donald Trump has just appointed, and that's Mike Huckabee, since his name came up. And Einat Wilf, let me get you to start on this. He is an evangelical Christian. He does believe, as Khalid said, that the end times can only happen and the Messiah can only return when all the Jews return to Israel, which will bring about the revelations as described in the New Testament. And I want to pause it all for the possibilities in the region.
First of all, there tends to be a general misunderstanding of evangelicals in the U.S. The tiny minority are what you described as millenarians. The vast majority simply believe that if you bless Israel and the Jewish people, you will be blessed. Also, they tend to be people who belong to the view that they read directly the Old Testament, so they have a clear understanding, which is constantly being denied by our enemies, of the historical, cultural, ritual, uninterrupted connection between the people of Israel and the land of Israel. There's no doubt that he believes in annexation, and all I can say as someone who herself does not support annexation is that last time that we even had the threat of annexation, what we got was 4 peace and normalization agreements. So given the vast imbalance in numbers, 7 million Jews surrounded by 500 million Arabs, which despite positive developments in the Gulf are still by and large devoted to what Ambassador Abba Eban called policide, the non-existence of the Jewish state, supported by 2 billion Muslims who largely are of that view. It's not too bad to have about 100 million evangelicals who support a president who basically will therefore perhaps force the Arab and Islamic world to contend with the idea that Israel is not a temporary aberration in the region and that they finally have to bring to an end their century-long war against the existence of a Jewish state and any borders.
Khalid, as you look at Team Trump, Mike Huckabee in Israel, Marco Rubio as Secretary of State, Elise Stefanik as the new United Nations ambassador, what emerges from that list as far as your characterization of the possibilities in the region?
Yeah, I think the common thread running through all of them is an intense hostility toward all things Palestinian, across the spectrum, ranging from anything and everything that Palestinians do is illegitimate. Palestinian politics are illegitimate. Palestinian aspirations are illegitimate. On one hand, like Marco Rubio, all the way to the other end of the spectrum, Mike Huckabee and Pete Hegseth, the designated defense secretary, who simply don't believe in a Palestinian people and believe that God orders events in the Middle East, and therefore, what sort of diplomacy could be allowed.
Let's dive in. You point out more people are going to cast electoral ballots in 2024 and next year, 25, than at any other moment in human history. And so far, if you look at what's happened in 2024, from 10 Western governments facing election this year, they all either lost or they all certainly lost vote share. That's the first time in more than 120 years of record keeping that that has happened. Question, what does that tell us about the political moment we are in?
Well, the two things. I mean, the first of all, the stats about the super democracy year or period are remarkable. That would seem on the surface to indicate that it's a good time for democracy because a lot of people are going to the polls and exercising their franchise. But what we've seen so far is that there's a big pushback against incumbency. And to me, that suggests that there's a great deal of discontent with the current arrangement. And whether that means late capitalism in some kind of death throes, environmental and climate crisis, or simply just a kind of shift of thinking about the nature of government and the relationship of citizens to government, that really is going to take a long time to shake out. But this pushback against the incumbents is something that I think political theorists have to pay a lot of attention to, and politicians should be worried about.
You know, I remember having our current UN ambassador, Bob Ray, in that chair many years ago, and we tried to talk political theory about why, you know, this party loses and that party wins and so on. And he said, you know, sometimes it's possible that just at the end of the day, the folks want the ins outs and the outs ins.
Yeah.
Does it get more complicated than that?
I don't think it does at some level. You know, it's but the problem is that say goodbye to the old boss, here's the new boss, and people think that they're getting change by exercising this kind of choice to get rid of, you know, kick the bums out. It's not necessarily going to change in the ways that they want. So I think if you look at you know, everyone's focused on the American election. What is that vote about? A lot of things, but one is certainly a discontent with the way things are seen to be arranged. And that would mean not just Washington and inside the Beltway politics, but just the idea of government having a kind of say in people's lives. So a lot of it is just discontent, unfocused until you get in front of that ballot box and then you say, you know what, I don't like this guy or this woman. I'm going to vote for something different or what I imagine is different.
Having said that, you write the remarkable thing about human societies is that they function at all. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think we should always remember this. First of all, go back to the original point. Isn't it amazing that so many people even have the capacity to vote and that they are allowed to have a say in how their daily affairs are ordered?
It's a relatively new phenomenon in
really
world
is.
history.
Yeah,
yes.
and we forget about this. I mean, we tend to think of political history in terms of maybe decades, but we should think of it more in terms of centuries. The liberal idea, the idea that we can disagree about certain fundamental things but still live together peaceably, that idea is only about 400 years old in terms of its influence on the Western world. It's an achievement, and it's a fragile achievement. So the franchise itself is a great thing to see. We have to, of course, abide by the results, and the results sometimes can be unsettling. They can even be self-defeating. That's what I think a lot of people worry about. Democracy can become its own enemy. But one of the reasons I wrote this book was to try to highlight some of the things that start out as good intentions, wanting to be informed and have your authorities transparent to you to justify power, not just exercise it, and how that desire for justification and transparency can sometimes turn around on itself.
I suspect we could have a great debate about what the greatest invention of all time was. Everything from the iPhone to the screw, which is a pretty important invention as well. However, I mean, if you read this book, you might think that the invention of trust is the greatest invention of all time. You want to put that on the record?
Sure. I mean, trust is a technology, first of all. I think that's one good way to think about it. It is driven by human desire, our need to have certain goods made possible that we can't achieve alone. And so we need to trust. Trust then becomes evolutionarily adaptive because it allows us to accomplish goals and survive challenges that we couldn't do otherwise. In that sense, it's the basis of institutions, of functioning bureaucracies, of exchanges, contract. So anything that's really basic to human interaction has an element of trust in it.
Would you go so far as to say that without trust in the institutions, which are the foundation of democracy, democracy must fail.
Yes, I would absolutely say that. And I think that's one of the reasons we have this focus on critical trust deficits in institutions. And we can take them institution by institution. One of the reasons I started writing this book was to try to focus sector by sector, media, politics, academia, science, public health, and try to see how the trust in those institutions or the structures that govern those aspects of life had eroded over time and why. And of course, that's an encyclopedia all by itself, just detailing, providing the evidence of that crisis of trust. So I wanted to move then to a kind of critical analysis. Why is this happening? Why are people losing trust in institutions? And what can we do about it? So that's really what this book is about.
We're going to get to the what can we do about it in a second, but let me follow up on that last point. We seem to be in a time which is really different from, say, when we were kids, where you actually did have a pretty good amount of trust in some of the bigger institutions that kind of governed your world. But that's all been, I don't know, but all. So much of it has been replaced today by our trust in our tribe. We only care about what's happening in our tribe, and we don't want to know from anything else. Yeah. How problematic is that for democracy?
Well, very much so. And you know, it highlights a couple of interesting things. One is that trust often functions best when it's invisible. So, you know, to call it a technology would seem to suggest, oh, it's a tool in front of us on a table or workbench or something like that. That's not how it works. It works by being a kind of implicit arrangement, an attitude, and I would even argue eventually a kind of psychology of being in the world, whereby we can engage in activities with an expectation that they're going to work out for everybody.
And that is the agenda for Friday, November 29th, 2024. Monday on the program, do governments rely too heavily on binding arbitration to resolve labor disputes? We'll look into that. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again on Monday.